Canaan. Jim is a leader in the field of conservation and conservation finance, as well as conservation stewardship. And in New Canaan, we know that conservation finance is critical because conserved land is forever, but the money to pay for it is needed when opportunities arise. Robin spoke about having a war chest, and that's so important if you want to be able to act when properties come on the market. Jim is the co-founder and former director of the International Land Conservation Network at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. He was also the former director of the Program on Innovation at Harvard Forest. He has served as a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Highstead Foundation, which is nearby in Reading. Jim is a graduate of Yale College and the Yale School of Management, where he was named a William Donaldson Fellow, which is an honor given to alumni for career achievements that exemplify the mission of the school to educate leaders for business and society. Jim has written and edited numerous publications. His most recent is From the Ground Up: How Land Trusts and Conservancies Are Providing Solutions to Climate Change. Help me in welcoming Jim Levitt.
Okay. Thank you. So the title of my talk is How Land Conservation Can Contribute to Sustainable Prosperity. I'm going to begin with land trusts. I'm going to end with land trusts. But I'm going to cover a lot of territory in between. It's all related to how land trusts contribute to a whole that might give us a little optimism for the environment over the next 50 years. It's a big topic. I want everyone to think over a long term, just as the presentation before us asked you to do. I want you to think 50 years back, and I will want you to think 50 years forward. When I think 50 years back, or more precisely 47 years back, I can tell you that I was a housemate with Toddy Turrentine. We were graduate students together at the Yale School of Management, and Toddy was always ready with really interesting conversation at breakfast. We had another housemate who lived with us who was very successful in business, and then he got into politics, and he did pretty well in politics as well. His name is Ned Lamont, and it's so nice to be in the state that I think he governs very well. So the big challenge, even bigger than land trusts, is the challenge that E.O. Wilson gave us before he passed away in 2002. He wrote in Scientific American the following: "We have entered the century of the environment in which the immediate future is usefully conceived of as a bottleneck. Science and technology, combined with a lack of self-understanding and a Paleolithic obstinacy, brought us to where we are today. Now, science and technology, combined with foresight and moral courage, must see us through the bottleneck and out." And I'm here to tell you with quite a straight face that land trusts can be a very important part of that equation. Now, I want to do a little thought experiment with all of you. I want you to close your eyes and think of the place that you go to when you're stressed out and you want to find a place in nature that you can imagine in your mind that gives you some peace. I'll give you 15 seconds to do that. Okay, now slowly open your eyes and imagine that place 50 years from now under your best understanding of the impact of climate change. Now, show of hands, how many of you see that place in 50 years as as improved in some way, as in even more vibrant condition than it's in today. And we have one, that's good. How many of you see it as somehow degraded or challenged in any case? So the majority of this audience. So that already makes my job easier. That's a good thing to know. So these places are certainly under challenge, and I'm not going to sugarcoat my optimism by telling you that I'm unaware of the challenges. We know that scientists at the University of Miami in Florida have predicted that by the year 2060, 60% of the city of Miami will be underwater. Imagine the amount of property that would be damaged if 60% of Miami and Newport News and part of New York City and Boston, where I live, I actually live in Belmont, which is a suburb of Boston, were inundated with water. And then consider that several experts who are quoted up here, one who's the former insurance commissioner for the state of California, another is a director of Allianz, which is one of the leading insurance companies, property insurance companies in Europe, have already predicted that if we don't change the course, the trajectory which we're on, there may not be a property insurance market 50 years from now. Now, that sounds kind of technical, like it might not impact each of you in New Canaan, Connecticut, but consider the fact that without property insurance, you can't get a mortgage. And without a mortgage market, you do serious damage to capital markets. And without capital markets, capitalism is difficult to operate. So we're talking about really serious threats. Now, it's at this point during this presentation where my wife says, "So Jim, I thought your presentation was about environmental optimism." Okay, I'm going to ask you to imagine a scenario in which some of these things don't happen. In fact, in which we fulfill the challenge that E.O. Wilson gave us. And it involves land trusts and many other things. It's a scenario, and those of you who have been in strategic planning or planning for land trusts understand that if you have a scenario or a narrative that you can recall and believe in, it really helps you get to that strategic objective that you're aiming for. We know, for instance, that the achievement of apartheid in South Africa, of bringing down apartheid in South Africa, was achieved through imagining a scenario in which the world changed. And indeed, it isn't perfect, but they made a lot of progress. Let's start with the well-known ways that land trusts and land conservation can enhance our communities. And Robin very articulately articulated some of those, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with them. So I'll go through them quickly. But protecting open space, stewarding open space in an appropriate manner, allows you to improve water quality, to buffer flood control, to recharge water supplies on the surface and in aquifers. I grew up in Kansas City, and I know that the aquifer that goes through Nebraska and Kansas, called the Oglala Aquifer, is being rapidly depleted, and that's a very serious problem. It provides wildlife habitat. It mitigates heat island effects. It allows carbon to be sequestered in trees and more, but let's just begin with the trees. It provides social and mental health benefits that have been measured by psychologists. It enhances the value of your property over the long term, and that's many, many, many economic studies show that land that is closer to open space is more valuable than the same property that isn't close to open space. And for example, all you have to do is imagine Central Park and its environs in New York City, or the land around the Boston Common in Boston, which is some of the very most valuable real estate in New England. It also offers us potential to partner with affordable housing organizations and address some of the social problems that we have in this country. So all of those, I think, are familiar to many of you, and I won't give you a whole talk about that, although if anyone wants to talk about it later, I'm happy to do so. There are 6 factors that I want to talk about this evening. They all start with P for mnemonic reasons to allow you to remember them, and they are power, population, protein, pollution control, productivity, efficiency, and innovation, and protecting land and water to animate the carbon cycle. That's where land trusts come in. So 50 years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Yale, I started to study something called a photovoltaic cell. And at that time, photovoltaic cells in the mid-1970s cost about $100 a watt. Today, photovoltaic cells, following a learning curve, if any of you have done strategic planning in a corporate setting, cost between 4 and 8 cents a watt. That's a reduction in cost of nearly 500 times over 50 years. The result of that sharp decline in price, I mean really sharp decline in price, is like the reduction in price of the microchips that run your cell phone. Wouldn't be possible unless that happened. And these kind of price reductions with technology happen throughout our society. The result of that is that solar and wind are the cheapest form of electrical power in almost all of the world. They're cheaper than coal, they're cheaper than natural gas, they're cheaper than nuclear. Geothermal may give them a run for the money in the future, but right now they're cheaper than geothermal. That means that something like 90% of all the incremental power installed in the United States last year and the year before that were either solar or wind. So I'm not going to get tremendously political tonight, but despite political initiatives in this country, the spread, the dissemination, the utilization of solar and wind are happening to some extent in this country and to a much greater extent outside of this country. I think one of the things that all of us have to get used to is the fact that if it isn't happening in the United States, it may still be happening. China is by far the leader in the world in these technologies, but Chile and Pakistan and India and many other countries across the world are adopting this technology at an unbelievable rate. And if you're interested in this particular topic, Bill McKibben just wrote a book called Here Comes the Sun that explains this in detail. But because of industrial work and a lot of good planning, these technologies, which don't emit any carbon or any climate change gases, are beginning to become the dominant technology in the world. In fact, I'm happy to announce tonight, this was just in the Boston Globe, that the last coal-fired power plant in New England closed this week. So we live in a region in the world that is something to clap about, where there's no coal power. We can make tremendous progress still. This learning curve isn't done. Solar is going to reduce in price another multiple times over our lifetimes and the lifetimes of our children and our grandchildren. So in the world today, renewables actually generate more power than all of the installed coal capacity in the world. That's a very important milestone. We are seeing the first signs of a crucial turning point. Solar and wind are now growing fast enough to meet the world's growing appetite for electricity. We know this from Ember, which is a firm that tracks this in England. The same thing is happening with electric cars. Again, If the United States isn't leading the world in this trend, it's certainly happening every place else. And we're keeping up. But it doesn't have to come out of a factory or a laboratory in the United States to be real. What can you do? Use solar or wind energy directly at your residence if that's practical. If not, try to find a community solar company that can help you do that. Drive a hybrid or electric car, and shop at companies that use it on their roof. And these are such unlikely candidates as Costco, IKEA, and Walmart. Walmart has one of the largest collection of solar arrays of any retail company in the world. Okay, second factor, population. And this is not one that's well known, but this is a graph, I'm sorry. This got a little bit, I can't move it, but the fertility replacement rate in the world is 2.1 children per woman of reproductive age. So if all the women in the European Union are having that are of reproductive age are having fewer than 2.1 children, then the population either stabilizes or begins to reduce. That means that, let's see if this is in the next chart, the revisions by the United Nations show that population in the world is likely to peak in the next 40 or 50 years. And their projections are progressively a lower peak and a nearer term for that to happen. Now, this is a very complicated subject and it has a lot of implications. Never in any of our lives have we not been planning for a very rapidly expanding population in this country and in the world. That's why we have housing shortages. That's why we're racing to produce enough food in the world to feed everyone. But that particular pressure is very likely to abate during our children and grandchildren's lifetime. There will be intense political debates about this in the United States. I'm just informing you about a secular trend that you might not be aware of. What can you do? It's really very simple. Support women's rights to get an education, to get into the workforce, to choose whether or not they want to have children. All of the demographers that I've read about on this topic say that the reason this is happening and the reason this will continue to happen is because women have greater rights, not only in this country, but in India, in China, maybe not yet in Afghanistan, but it's probably coming. I imagine that this is a topic on which the majority of the people in this audience can agree upon. Spread the word. Protein. Another really important factor in all of this that not everyone is aware of. In the lower 48 United States, the amount of land, acres, I'm not talking about arable acres, I'm not talking about habitable acres, I'm talking about all acres, that is dedicated to feeding and grazing livestock, especially cows, is more than 40%. More than 40% of all the acres in the United States are dedicated to growing meat. I'm not trying to tell you not to eat meat. I love a steak every once in a while. But the impact of that you should be conscious of. The chart on the right side of the screen, that brown bar is the carbon impact of beef, which is something like 99 kilograms per pound of I'm going to get it wrong. I think per pound of protein, but if it's an index, beef is at 100. And things like Poultry are at about 9.8, eggs 4.6, bananas at 0.86. So if you choose your calories wisely, I'm not trying to tell anybody to be a vegetarian, but if you choose your calories wisely, you can have a tremendous impact on the climate emissions associated with your lifestyle. The good news is that I can go to Whole Foods today and buy eggs in a milk carton. They're not eggs, they're made from mung beans that taste like scrambled eggs to me, that have about 10% of the impact of natural eggs. And you could see on the chart before that eggs are a very low carbon emitter anyway. So this is not, I'm not telling you about technologies that are far in the future. I'm talking about things that exist right now. In fact, I had to go into my recycle bin and find this to bring to show you tonight. There is stuff being worked on in labs that's going to make protein that can be made into milk or eggs or beef or bacon or cake or pasta that is made from a thimbleful of microbes that are fed CO2 and air and solar energy. And the cost of the cost of these, while it is high today, is coming down that same learning curve that I showed you with solar cells. So there is a company in California called Air Protein that is proposing in the next 5 to 10 years, they will be able to extract and grow protein essentially out of the air. This is a NASA technology that we brought down to Earth. What you can do, all I ask is that you keep an open mind, that you try the products, that you consider being an early user, because the environmental impact can be immense. 40% of the landscape of the lower 48 is 900 million acres. All of New England is about, trying to remember, but I'd say 60 million acres. We're talking about 800 million acres of land. And if we can reduce that to some extent, the carbon implications and the sustainability of wildlife and open space, it's enormous. Pollution control, and I'm going to move through this quickly because I think I'm running out of time. We are much better today at controlling pollution than we were before. With satellites, we can tell you where every single abandoned gas well in the United States is that's emitting methane into the air. Methane has about 30 times the climate impact of CO2. So reducing methane quickly could make a tremendous difference. And if you say, well, I'm not sure that's possible, let me remind you that in between 2000 and 2022 or 23, China reduced its particulate emissions, so this is a different measure, but particulate emissions by 41%. So it can be done. None of this is beyond the wit of mankind. None of this is stuff that we're not doing today. So pollution control is also just at our reach right now from what used to be called non-source points of pollution. And then there's the innovation factor. I just told you about Solein, which is this solar protein product. Actually, that's coming out of Finland. Air Protein is coming out of California. In addition to that, there are technologies endorsed by the current administration, renewable energy technologies that get electric power out of advanced geothermal drilling. So again, not to go on for too long about this, but there's a maser, which is a millimeter wave beam that's being directed at granite and basalt that can go 5 to 10 times faster than oil drilling can at the surface and can continue to go down, we believe, they're testing it now, perhaps 10 miles into the earth, where the temperatures are 700 degrees Fahrenheit, which produces supercritical water, which if you bring that heat up to the surface, can give you the equivalent of a coal-fired power plant anywhere on Earth. Any place that can get a little bit deeper into the core of the Earth can generate tremendous amounts of electricity. Even enough electricity to power all the data centers that we might want to build. And then finally, back to land protection. And I want to congratulate all the work that's being done here in New Canaan on butterfly gardens, on pollinating, on getting rid of invasives, doing all the things that you need to do to get native species back on the land. But there is new science out. One of the people who is putting it out is a guy named Oswald Schmitz, who's a professor at the Yale School of the Environment, that says that if you take one piece of open space that's just trees and grass, and you compare it to a comparable piece of open space that's trees and grass and bison that are roaming naturally on that same property, then the landscape which is animated, that is, which is repopulated with the native species that are supposed to be living on that land or that did live on that land in the past, the carbon retention of the soil or of the marine systems that we're talking about can increase by 3 to 12 times. So if you have, let's say, 300 million acres of land in the United States, which McDonald's isn't buying hamburger for because they have plausible substitutes, and you put bison on that land and you let them roam as they did 300 years ago, then you have a dramatic impact on climate change gases. And that goes for your butterfly gardens in your backyard in New Canaan as well. We know this from a guy named Doug Talamay, who I think has been in New Canaan twice over the last 5 or 10 years, and has started something called Backyard National Parks. We know that land conservation comes in sizes like t-shirts. It can be a onesie, it can be tiny, it can be small, it can be medium, it can be large, it can go up to triple XL, like the Indian reservation in Canada. They're called reserves in Canada, and I shouldn't use the word Indian, I should say Indigenous people reserves in Quebec, where the Cree people, who have 100 million acres of territory within their treaty rights, just protected in an indigenous protected land 10 million acres, and they plan to ramp that up to 30, 40 million acres over the next couple of years. So all of the things we're doing from onesies up to triple XL, they all contribute. The 400 acres that you have in New Canaan, the 2 million acres plus of protected land that we have in Massachusetts, that's a statistic that I happen to be familiar with, the 10 million acres that the Cree are protecting in Quebec, and so on, from the United States and Europe to China and Australia and New Zealand. They're all making a really important difference in getting through the bottleneck. And I was looking at your impact report, and I know, for example, your attention to your forests and your champion trees. I love that program. I would love to see, Toddy's going to take me on a little tour tomorrow, and I would love to see some of the champion trees that you have in New Canaan. So, to conclude, each of the 6 P elements that I've been talking about, power, population, protein, pollution control, productivity and innovation, and land protection to animate the carbon cycle. These are all technologies and techniques that are ripe, that are on the shelf either now or in the next 5 to 10 years. We can choose to ignore them. If we choose to ignore them, we may not have property insurance for our great-grandchildren. That would be a sad day. So I think I have some time for questions.
Yeah, if you can raise your hand, Robin is on that side of the room, I'm over here, we'll come to you with the microphone.
And
We have a question here.
one of the things I'd love to hear as you ask your questions, and I know there are many different kind of questions, is what in what I just presented to you is plausible? And one of it is like, what's he talking about? I need to hear that.
We have two here. You want to?
When you were talking about the cost of solar dramatically falling by
Yes.
whatever the
500
500%.
times over
Yeah.
50 years.
So, and when you talk about solar's impact in the environment in terms of a cleaner energy, does that take into account the input factors of it, of producing the solar and the materials that go into that as well? I mean, is that factored into your net analysis?
It is, and I'll tell you, but the cost of modules falling 500 times doesn't address the question that you're asking. But the something that I understand recently is if we devoted the amount of acres in the United States that are used to grow biofuels, I can't tell you off the top of my head how many acres that is, to agrivoltaics, where you actually grow agricultural products on the land and you put up vertical photovoltaics in the crop rows between them, then you could vastly increase the amount. I think it's double or triple the amount of electricity produced in the United States today. So yes, it's a modest impact. The impact is like 5% the impact of a new natural gas or coal plant. So yes, the environmental impact, which is a different question you're asking, is being considered and is vastly less impactful than it is for the electric technologies that we've been using for 100 years.
I thank you so much for this very interesting lecture. At the beginning, one of your slides, you had a list of some things, and you said that you weren't going to address them in the lecture, but something caught my eye, and it's definitely super relevant to New Canaan and Connecticut.
Yes.
And it seems that there is like a inherent conflict right now between the push and the organizations that are pushing for more affordable housing and density and those who are looking to preserve open space. And I find myself, like, in terms of what my values are, because I very much am interested in land conservation, and you know, I'm interested in hearing how you might reconcile that. And an example I would use is like what's just gone on recently in New York City. You'll hear about like these beautiful gardens in downtown. I have two daughters that live in more dense places like Brooklyn and downtown, and
I have two children in Brooklyn, so
yeah,
I know
okay.
exactly what
But they
you're
want to
talking
do
about.
away with these beautiful gardens, and
Right.
then, you know, there's the sort of moral high ground of, well, we need more dense and higher housing, but at the expense of what? So how do you reconcile that?
That's an excellent question. I have two thoughts on that. One is, in Massachusetts, we have something called the Community Preservation Act. And it raises money. It's a transfer tax that towns can vote on to implement or not. So it's a home rule provision. That part of the funding raised through this provision, which is instituted in half of the 350-some towns in Massachusetts, 10% of it has to go to affordable housing, 10% of it has to go to land conservation, and 10% of it has to go to historic preservation. The rest of the 70% is up to the Community Preservation Act committee in that town. So I actually think that politically and financially, the affordable housing and the land conservation communities are partners and should be partners and should work together. There's a guy working in New York State just across the border from here named Steve Rosenberg, who used to work for Scenic Hudson, who was leading a movement to have land trusts and land conservation organizations that acquire large parcels of land to set aside 5% of that land for affordable housing, which is usually not very complicated to do because these are all pieces of land that have margins that are near roads that wouldn't really be degraded if you took 5% and built condominiums on them for affordable housing. And I think that's an approach that the Land Trust Alliance, which is the national umbrella organization for land trusts in the United States, is quite interested in, and it's got a lot of promise. So if you have land available and you figure out a way to finance both land conservation and affordable housing at the same time, I think you can ease your moral concern a little bit. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question also related to this list regarding heat island mitigation.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you had some specific suggestions. For example, we have a beautiful downtown, but in July especially, it gets exceedingly hot. We have a lot of concrete and parking lots and whatever. And this year, the town, with the help of some organizations, did a wonderful tree planting effort on one of our main avenues, South Avenue. But what else do you think in terms of like creating microforests or adding trees to the community, based on your background and experience? What do you recommend?
Well, I actually think you know the answer to this question, but I'm happy to reinforce it. So these Miyawaki forests, these microforests that people are planting all over Cambridge and Belmont and the places that I'm in most days, are brilliant little innovations. They only take a quarter of an acre, and they're just densely packed with vegetation that both absorbs carbon and cools the area because you don't have these impervious surfaces there. You have a small forest. In addition to that, I'm trying to recall the name of it. It's in this book that Toddy talked about before, which is called From the Ground Up, How Land Trusts Are Addressing Climate Change. It's called Baltimore Community Works or something like that, and I'm happy to look it up for you later. That is looking for opportunities to do these kind of interventions all over Baltimore County. And they're having tremendous success. And part of it is taking degraded parks that people have neglected, that basically have some grass on them and some dirt, and intensively improving them so that they absorb water, because flooding's a real problem in Baltimore, so that they mitigate the heat island effect, so that they have many of the impacts that I'm listing here. So a lot of it has to do with looking at your existing infrastructure and thinking where you can put things like microforests, as well as improving properties that have been neglected. I think those two things are a good start, but I know that there's a lot of attention to this in New Canaan, and I think it's great. I think that the tree planting in a downtown area, it's obvious that that's going to mitigate heat impact because it shades buildings, and everybody knows that it's better to be under a shady tree on a hot summer day than out on the sidewalk. And we desperately need it. In Phoenix, Arizona, last summer, I'm not going to remember the percentage, but a high number of people who fell on the sidewalk came into the hospital with second and third degree burns. That's how hot it's getting in some of our cities on concrete surfaces. Now, I'm not predicting that for New Canaan, but it's a really serious problem, and we can make a lot of progress on it.
Hi. Quick question. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of pushback to the solar paneling as well as the wind turbines as a source of power due to the fact that a lot of people feel it's not reducing their energy costs, their utility bills, and that the windmills in particular, especially up in the Cape, are causing a lot of environmental damage, particularly to animals like the birds. How do you respond to that?
Honestly, you're misinformed, A. I know about the bird issue in some detail from serving on the board of Massachusetts Audubon. And the conservation organizations that have supported well-placed wind turbines in Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard have put them in places where the migratory birds are not traveling. They also have sensors that can turn the turbines off when they see a flock of birds coming at them. So they've vastly reduced the health of the bird populations that live in those areas. And for the critics who say there are lots of birds being killed, sometimes I wonder when was the last time they were concerned about, bird populations. I have no idea what the documented impacts of solar panels that are negative that have been reported in scientific journals or any other credible source of information. I don't know what those impacts are, particularly when you're using things like agrivoltaics that can be co-located with agriculture. But if you can document that for me and show me actually what the damage is, I think people would love to address those damages and mitigate them as quickly as they can. But people who claim vast environmental damage from things like wind turbines and solar power typically, and I can't say universally because I don't know that, but typically won't give you any measurements, any sightings, any long-term observations that document that. And I think, we live in a complicated political environment, and I understand that. So I would invite them to bring forward good documentation and show us how we can reduce the problem. Okay. Any other ones? That's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. I really appreciate that because I think that's something that needs to be aired and addressed when we can address it.
Yes, you had a slide there showing the maximum population of the Earth peaking at about 12 billion or something in that range.
Wait, hold on.
Well, maybe, 12 billion?
It's something like 11 in the most recent forecast, which is the blue forecast. And every year that the United Nations issues that forecast, it keeps creeping down. So I think the peak actually now, among demographers who understand how the curves are changing, is somewhere around 10 billion.
I remember when that was reported, I think in the New York Times a couple of years ago.
Right.
And the thing that really shocked me then is that they extended the curve down where the population was going to come down to radically to something in the order of 2 billion or 3 billion or something in that, or in the scope of 100 years. And that shook me because it meant that was a total game changer in terms of all our cities are going to be overbuilt and we're going to be able to feed the population and all the rest of it. Is that still a prediction that it's going to come down that radically, or is that out of date?
There are lots of predictions, and I honestly am not qualified to tell you exactly how that curve is going to work 100 years from now. I don't know. 2 billion sounds like an awfully low number to me.
Well, it sounded it to me too, and they were saying it's because women are basically taking charge, and with birth control.
Right.
They don't want families of 5; they
Right.
want families of 2 or 1.
Right. I mean, I think the important thing to note is that the reason that in the past, like hundreds of years ago, women needed to have big families is because child mortality was so high. Child mortality all over the earth has dramatically reduced itself. And I think that, if we aim and try to offer incentives to try to level it out after a modest reduction, that's something to celebrate. But the important thing to remember is this changes the whole way we think about economics. We have always said growing the population and growing the output and growing the number of molecules that we mess around with is going to increase our well-being. And now we're facing a scenario because of people's individual choices where this population curve isn't just going to continue exponentially expand. And so I think there are a lot of things that need to be rethought. I don't want to stand up here and tell you I have all the answers to that, but it's a tremendous problem, or it's a tremendous opportunity, challenge. I don't know what word to use with it, but it's a tremendous change. And places like Italy and South Korea and Japan have tried all kinds of things to increase their birth rate, and it hasn't really made much difference. So I don't have a definitive answer to that, but again, I don't think it's beyond our human capacity to figure it out.
I think we have time for one more question before we break and allow people to chat with Jim. Do we have one more question?
Here, we've got one. Robin wants to ask one. Oh, you were waving at somebody. Okay. I saw your hand going like this, and I thought, well, anyway, I really have enjoyed this a lot. You're a very well-informed audience. I don't think I lost anybody's attention, or at least I can't tell that I have. And if you have specific feedback for me on anything that I've said and you want to come up to me afterwards, I actually do take notes on what people tell me, because I'm trying to sand the rough edges off of this set of presentations. But I want to leave you with the fact that there are scenarios that say, not only to the people in this audience, but to your children, that we're not headed for unquestioned disaster. There are ways to address this that are within our reach, and it's our responsibility as the adults in the room to try to do so. So thank you very much.
So thank you so much to Jim Levitt for coming tonight for our annual meeting. We did want to, Land Trust, give you a thank you package. We have some of our honey made from our hives on our preserves. We have wood bowl from the Bristow oak. We have information about Bristow Park as well, and some other goodies. So thank you so much.
I even have one of your Christmas ornaments. This is great.
Okay, great. All right,
Thank
and
you.
Thank you so much for everyone coming tonight. We'll have some drinks in the back. Please stay, and we'd love come chat with me or any of our board members if you have any questions. Thank you.